Henry Badcock sat by his roaring fire gazing into the flames. Kalyana showed Nathan into the large and opulent living room of the converted farmhouse, and offered him a beer which he gladly accepted. Without looking at the young man or formally greeting him, Badcock started going into details about the next shipment to the mainland. Nathan would take the family car over on the ferry, and would make his way to a rural address which he had not been to before. Henry assured Nathan that the appropriate officials had been taken care of, so it was a safe thing, as long as he didn't get stopped by the cops for speeding. When he reached the address, Nathan was to leave the car there, which Henry would pick up later himself, and make his own way back to the island. This was to be a heroin deal, a way bigger deal than anything young Mr. Bates had been involved in before. Nathan was promised a $3,000 payoff if everything went smoothly. He had never made more than 600 quid for a single deal before, so the prospect of this amount of cash naturally excited him. Maybe he was about to move a few rungs up the ladder, he thought. Kalyana brought Nathan his beer and a French brandy for her husband. Henry gave her a dirty look, and she left quickly. He was 10 years his wife's senior, but she could have passed for half his age. Henry was a wealthy man, but he remained unsatisfied. He had lived a life of luxury for the past 10 years, but this couldn't make up for his previous 40 years of brutality and living on the edge. He had had to fight and backstab his way to the top of the heap. He had killed allies and enemies in pursuit of his highest value, reputation. People in the business knew that Henry Badcock was not someone to fuck around, but in spite of his cold persona, Henry was actually haunted by his past. The blood he had shed had taken its toll on his mind. He had killed his own brother-in-law over a financial dispute. Henry wanted forgiveness from those who couldn't offer it, the dead. Anguish was a part of him. Henry regarded Nathan as little more than a tool, someone of low intelligence, someone to be used. Nathan looked up to Badcock as a father figure, like many of the other lads working for Henry. Nathan Bates could imagine himself in the role of Mr. Badcock, a feared trafficker who called the shots and made obscene piles of cash. Nathan had asked himself on more than one occasion if he was capable of being like Henry. Was he smart and ruthless enough to be the man? Could he kill? Kalyana had had enough of this life. This all had to come to an end somehow. For the longest time, she couldn't see a way out, but recently she had made a contact. A lifeline, perhaps, but one that she had to act on quickly. Arrangements were made. She knew she was risking her life, but she was better off dead than a slave. This she was convinced of. Her contact would call her again tonight to make sure everything was moving ahead. Kalyana drank vodka straight from the bottle as she stood in the kitchen, looking out of the window at the clear night sky. She had made some very bad choices in life, and was filled with remorse, but the flame of hope and the belief in God's grace remained. Neil had woken up feeling a little strange, but things got worse fairly quickly. He didn't feel physically ill. It was more a sense that he was not himself. He found himself on his hands and knees trying to deal with a panic attack. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. A cold sweat was upon him. After a while, he began to come through it. He lay on his side and opened his eyes. His heart was racing and he could not focus on any singular thing, until he pictured Dominique in his mind's eye. He pictured her standing over him with her arms folded. She looked distinctly unimpressed. For some reason this helped him get a grip. He remained on the floor, however, for at least an hour before getting up and going for a hot shower. Something was going very wrong. Something very important was abandoning him. Neil dried himself off and put on his clothes. He then sat down on a stool and faced the wall opposite the window. He stared at that wall for a good 20 minutes, barely blinking. A sense of emptiness had come over him. Neil was detached. Neil was in alien territory. Eventually he looked down and noticed that his shoes were a little dirty. Almost immediately he was in tears, crying like a child. He was then overtaken by the urge to look at himself in the mirror. He stood and watched himself cry. The more he looked upon his own image, the calmer he became. The emptiness returned. He would leave his room and the guest house without a plan in mind. In fact, it was as if he was on autopilot. No cautionary voice was coming from within as he walked along the lonely seafront. The shit had really hit the fan. The authorities had moved on Henry Badcock and his operation in a dawn raid on both his farms. The drug lord had not seen this coming. He could not have imagined that his own wife would betray him to the cops in exchange for immunity from prosecution and police protection. She had fucked him over royally. He had treated her like his personal property, never thinking for 1 second that his cold and macho behaviour would generate such devastating consequences. The cops had seized vast quantities of heroin and smaller amounts of cocaine. Henry had been arrested at the scene. Soon enough the police would pick up several of Badcock's little helpers who were in the vicinity. When they came for Nathan Bates, they found that he was not going to come quietly. Armed with a handgun that Henry had given him some months ago, he tried to shoot his way out, but was captured as he tried to escape through the back. Mary Bates was left in shock and dismay as her son was dragged away, screaming threats and obscenities as he was loaded into the back of the police van. The world had been cruel to a good woman. Mary did not deserve her shame and suffering. Before Badcock was driven away to the mainland, he was confronted by the woman who had led the investigation against him, and who had organised the bust itself. Dominique Lamar was a British citizen of French origins who had lived on the island for some time with her partner Fiona. She was a cool professional who hadn't allowed her hatred for Badcock to cloud her judgment. She had struck at the right moment. Henry had proved to be a difficult fish to catch. He was a slippery one for sure, but once Kalyana had turned informer, the writing was on the wall for Henry. This was his day of reckoning. Dominique's face-to-face with him was something of an indulgence, but she felt like she had earned it for all of her hard work and patience. With a sense of pride and a feeling of deep satisfaction, she departed the scene. She would attend the local police station to do some paperwork before heading home. On her way back, she saw Neil standing on an embankment looking out at the sea. It was a windy day, so she knew he wouldn't hear her if she called out to him. She thought he looked sad and lost standing there alone. She carried on home and was happy to be warmly greeted as ever by her sweet Fiona. The Reverend Adam Warren was surprised when informed by his cleaning lady that a man was sat in church in the middle of the aisle with legs crossed, staring at an image of Christ. Somewhat concerned, he went over from the vicarage to investigate. He found a young man, seemingly passive, looking a little ill and tired. He asked the man if he was all right. The man didn't respond at first. He continued to stare at the image. Adam sat down on the floor next to the man and waited. Eventually the man began to speak. He asked the priest if he had ever lost direction, or lost hope or faith. Adam told him that he had faced testing times and come through some dark experiences, but he could always rely on the Lord. The man then told him that the world was without meaning and all was chaos. Justice was an illusion, he said, as was God himself. Adam was not sure how to respond to this. He decided simply to ask the question, "What can I do for you, sir?" The man turned his head towards the priest and made eye contact, before replying, "You can't do for me, sir. I ask for nothing." With this he slowly got up, nodded at the priest and walked out of the building, his expression never changing. This was a disturbing episode for Adam. He believed this man might be dangerous. At the same time, his face looked vaguely familiar to him, but he couldn't quite place him. It was fairly late at the Foresters' Arms, close to closing time in fact, when Neil walked in. Barbara greeted him and asked him what he'd like to have. He ordered a double whiskey and parked on a stool. Barbara was not getting a good vibe from him at all. Maybe he was affected badly by the police bust earlier, she thought. Word had gotten around, of course. It was all folks were talking about in the pub on that evening. A local man had seen what had happened to Nathan, and had earlier that night told his version of events to anyone who would listen. Barbara wondered what must be going through Neil's mind right now. In reality, he knew nothing of the raid. Neil downed his drink in one and was about to leave when a lady came up on his right side and sat next to him. He recognised her as Claire Wise. She offered him a warm greeting and asked, "Well, it's been a while, hasn't it? How's life been treating you, Neil?" Neil looked straight into her eyes and said, "I'm beaten but not broken, Claire. I hope you're well. Please forgive me, but I must be on my way. I'm not well. Wouldn't want it to start catching." Neil then made a swift exit, leaving Barbara and Claire to look at one another in that way women do when they suspect someone is vulnerable and on the edge. Neil felt nothing other than the cold wind as he made his way back to the White Rock. Dominique and her girlfriend prepared for bed. They had been talking about an American couple who had just arrived, as they were performing their oral hygiene routines, but the French lady wanted to cut the conversation short. She kissed Fiona softly on the lips and then moved down to her neck. She began to remove her lover's nightgown, but Fiona took hold of Dominique's hands and gently pushed them away. After whispering something in her ear, she went downstairs to the kitchen. She would often get a few things ready for breakfast in advance, at this time of night, just when things were about to heat up in the bedroom. This would frustrate Dominique, but it would also tend to increase the passion between them once Fiona returned. Into the dimly lit room came Neil Potter. He was naked, with a wild look in his eyes. Dominique immediately jumped up, with cat-like reflexes, and fixed her stare on the intruder. "What are you doing up here, Neil?" she asked, calmly and softly. Neil then informed her that it wasn't fair or right, her teasing him these last couple of days. "A man can only take so much before action is needed," he said, with an intensity. Suddenly he launched at her, grabbing her arms and pushing them back above her head. They both fell backwards onto the bed. Neil tried to kiss her, but she moved her face away. The French cop managed to get one of her hands free. She reached down and seized hold of his testicles. She squeezed them with violent intensity, causing Neil to squeal in pain and jump backwards. As he stood up off the bed, Dominique delivered a sharp kick into his groin, dropping him to the floor with a thud. With him down in a horizontal position, she delivered several more kicks into his most vulnerable area, until he pleaded for her to stop. Fiona was now stood at the door with a shocked look on her face. She turned on the main light and attempted to speak, but was unable. Dominique went over to her and lightly touched her face before telling her to call the police. Fiona was frightened and confused, but was able to do as she was told. She contacted the local station and told them they must come deal with an intruder. She didn't quite know what was happening herself. Dominique put the incapacitated Neil in handcuffs. Before the police car arrived, she offered some words to her attacker. "I think you need some help, Neil, but I can't be the one to do it." Dominique explained what had happened to the two officers who arrived on the scene, which started a little question and answer session. Fiona stepped forward and suggested she get some of Neil's clothes before they take him away. One of the cops went with her to his room to get some clothes and have a look around. The American couple who had checked in earlier were now in the hallway, worriedly asking questions. Fiona tried to calm them down. She said that the police had just caught a burglar and everything was okay. They eventually returned to their room. As Neil Potter was taken away, Fiona and Dominique watching on, a feeling of happiness washed over him. He felt well again. He didn't care if charges were going to be pressed or not. He knew in this moment that he was all right. That's what mattered. What did the nostalgic man find? He found pain and humiliation. He found joy and excitement. He found truth. He found that the present is all that exists.